The 5th of October 1968 is generally acknowledged as the day that the Troubles broke out in Northern Ireland. A crowd organised by the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association was marching against discrimination in housing in Londonderry. NICRA, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association, was a peaceful group based on American civil rights associations, for example those led by Martin Luther King, and they very much wanted a peaceful demonstration. However, there were those among them known as the Derry Radicals who wanted something closer to a revolution against the upper classes who ran Northern Ireland. The Radicals persuaded NICRA to organise their march inside Derry's walls and to make sure that they would gather in the part of Derry known as the Waterside, because these were traditional Protestant areas where only Protestants should march, and the vast majority of members of NICRA were Roman Catholics. They were perceived as a Roman Catholic organisation. Because of that, the Apprentice Boys of Londonderry decided to organise a counter-demonstration on the same day, and the Northern Irish government decided that the best way to avoid any trouble was simply to ban both marches. The Apprentice Boys complied. They did not march that day, but NICRA, with pressure from the Derry Radicals, insisted on going ahead, and so a crowd began to march up Duke Street, where a row of RUC officers opposed them. The Royal Ulster Constabulary was the name of the police force of the day. The police officers were very keen to avoid trouble as well. Eamon McCann, one of the Derry Radicals, actually said afterwards that in the middle of every riot there's always some idiot standing around waiting for a meeting to break out. And he became very frustrated as the organisers from NICRA began to appeal for calm and began to try to organise their supporters to simply protest the fact that their way was being blocked by the RUC and to return home peacefully. But the Radicals would have their way, and there was a bit of anger in the crowd, and after a while a few placards were thrown towards the RUC lines. There was a bit of anger on both sides, and eventually the RUC began to panic that they were losing control of the situation, and they baton charged the crowd. They broke a bit rough, but they broke, commented one RUC officer afterwards, quite proud of the day's work. The problem was that in that crowd that broke a bit rough, there were Labour MPs, and Labour were the government of the day in Westminster and London. Gerry Fitt, a West Belfast MP, was struck on the head with a baton from an RUC officer, and Fitt, being no fool, made sure that the cut was not treated so that he could go up to the TV cameras and show how he had been treated by the police force of his country. Because RTE was there, and RTE, the Irish BBC if you like, broadcast these pictures to the world. Immediately as the pictures went out and as news about the RUC treatment went out, demonstrations and marches were organised across Northern Ireland by the nationalist community in support of NICRA. Riots broke out. The police looked like they were going to lose control of the situation. Northern Ireland looked as if the whole province was going to break a bit rough. And within a year, terrorist organisations would be plotting the murder of police officers, of members of the opposite community. British soldiers would be on the street. Within several years, 20,000 British soldiers. And the question is, how do we get from the 5th of October 1968 to the Troubles, which ran for 30 years in Northern Ireland and caused 3,000 deaths? To give you an idea of the scale of the Troubles, Northern Ireland had a population of about 1.5 million. If you were to live in America, which is a population of around 250 million, you would multiply that 3,000 by about 200 times. You would be talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deaths if America had had the same level of violence. The number 3,000 seems quite small, but Northern Ireland is actually quite a small place. 3,000 deaths over 30 years is actually a significant amount of violence. So we have to ask how we get from the 5th of October 1968 up to the Troubles, which led to the IRA and the UVF and the terrorist campaigns, which were organised against Britain and Ireland and sovereign states. But we also have to ask, how is it that we ended up in a situation in this first place? Why was the 5th of October 1968 able to happen at all? March 1963, Terence O'Neill became the 4th Prime Minister in Northern Ireland in 42 years of Northern Ireland's existence. Northern Ireland had broken off from the rest of Ireland when Ireland had got its independence earlier in the century, and those 6 counties were left in a sort of a limbo and a not very safe state. The Government of Ireland Act in 1920 had said that Northern Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom so long as Stormont, that's the Northern Irish Parliament, wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. Now that seems to leave Northern Ireland very safe. In fact, it does anything but. One vote by the majority of MPs in Parliament could create a united Ireland. And so Unionists, those who wanted to be part of Great Britain, lived in a paranoid state. They believed that they were under siege. And so they organised Northern Ireland in such a way that only one party could ever hold power. It was a one-party state. James Craig, the first Prime Minister, said it was a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. And you'll certainly see as time goes, as we begin to explain how the 5th of October 1968 was possible, what he meant by that. A Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. The difficulty being that 1/3 of Northern Ireland's population was Roman Catholic. It's actually more than that today. It's about 45%, but at this time we're talking about slightly over 1/3 of the population was Catholic, living in a country that was run for Protestants. And the Unionist Party made it very, very clear that no nationalist would ever get power. Lord Brookborough, who was the Prime Minister before Terence O'Neill, the man who replaced, he governed up until the age of 74. And Brookborough was famous for saying that he wouldn't have a Catholic about the place. And that's the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland saying he would not have a Catholic about the place, and he was quite happy to discriminate against them. He was also famous or infamous after he had retired. He appeared on TV and said in a TV interview that he didn't trust Roman Catholics because, quote, they did not stand for the national anthem, nor would they take their caps off when they passed the Union Jack. I don't know any Protestants today who take their caps off but when they pass the Union Jack, but for Lord Brookborough, this was a major problem on why he would not let Roman Catholics into power and why he did not trust them. Unionists very carefully made sure that there was no way that any nationalist party or any party that might have any sympathy for nationalism could get into power in Stormont. They used several techniques for this. One of them was making sure that the voting, the boundaries, the different areas that voted were drawn up in such a way that there would always be a Protestant majority. There was a trick of gerrymandering, of making sure that different areas were divided up in such a way that there would always be a majority of Unionists going to Stormont. They could also whip up paranoia at times of elections. So there was a group called the Northern Irish Labour Party, which became quite successful. It was for the working man, if you like. It wasn't particularly sectarian. So whenever elections came around, the Unionists would try and raise the spectre of an IRA threat. That was used to keep other parties out. And it wasn't just Stormont, the Parliament. There were councils. And in councils, in particular, Unionists had a huge amount of power. There were probably far too many councillors in Northern Ireland, about 1,000 at the time. The vast majority would have come in as Unionist. I mean, 25% were nationalists. Now remember, 1/3 of the population is nationalist, but only 25% are councillors. And this was done by rigging gerrymandering, by making sure that the area, so if you've got a town like Londonderry, you'll give if there's say 40% of your population is unionist, you'll divide that area up into 4 different seats, so 4 councillors come in, 4 unionist councillors. And then if 60% of your area of the city is Catholic, well, you divide that into 2 seats. So 60% of the people voting, they only get 2 seats. Now, that's not an accurate picture of what happened in Derry. It's just an illustration. But you get the idea of gerrymandering. It's making sure that the majority can only ever elect 2 people, the minority can elect 4, and so the majority outweigh the minority on the council. There was also a very undemocratic idea that only those with property were allowed to vote in council elections. You had to own a house to vote. Most of the working class people rented their accommodation, and certainly many Catholics rented their accommodation. You could buy rented accommodation, but the councils made sure that Catholics couldn't get houses in any area in which nationalists might get a majority. This became a huge problem in some areas. Derry was one area where there's a problem, Dungannon was another, and this is what would lead to the civil rights movement. One of the burning issues that would lead to the civil rights movement was the fact that Catholic families simply could not get good homes because unionist councillors would not allow them. But worse than telling people that you can't get a house which you can rent and then buy and therefore you'll never be able to vote, business owners got more votes than anybody else. If you owned a business, so if you had a house and a business and several properties, you got as many votes as many houses or how many buildings you owned. So there was no one man, one vote, one woman, one vote. The more money you had, the more votes that you had. And so that was a particular problem. Nationalists looked like they could not only never get into government at Stormont, but they couldn't even get control of local councils. Another problem was the nature of policing. The RUC, about 3,500 men at the time, were armed and could be quite heavily armed, and at times they had to be. I mean, there was a border campaign 58 to 62. The IRA launched a campaign on the border, and so RUC officers needed to be armed with machine guns, and they had armoured cars with heavy machine guns, and there was an understanding that the RUC was a fairly professional force, but they were much more heavily armed than the average police force in Europe. But along with them, there was a part-time group called the B Specials. The B Specials were a part-time police force who were also armed and were generally seen by nationalists as effectively a militia who were there to keep them in their place. The B Specials were mythical in Protestant culture. To say that you had an uncle or a grandfather who had been in the B Specials when I was young was, it was, wow, your grandfather or uncle really defended Ulster. The B Specials were feared or hated by many nationalist communities. There were many more of them than there were of the professional RUC. Despite their mythical status, they turned out not to be particularly useful, and in some situations may have contributed to the outbreak of the Troubles, as we'll see. And on top of all this, there is something called the Special Powers Act of 1921. This gave police officers the powers to search and arrest anyone without really so much as a by your leave, to detain somebody without a trial. In other words, we can arrest you without really telling you why you're being arrested, and we can take you straight to jail without giving you a fair trial, and incredibly, they could flog you. They could take out a stick and beat you without having to explain why they were doing it. Now, this did not happen. I mean, there aren't very many cases of floggings, or there aren't too many complaints of floggings, but the simple fact that the police had the power to do that, and a police officer who flogged somebody didn't necessarily have to explain to anybody why he did it. That gave the police a tremendous amount of power. Apartheid South Africa, at the same time in the 1960s, were envious of the Special Powers Act in Northern Ireland. Now, that we're talking about South Africa, which was one of the most brutal regimes in the world, were jealous of the powers that police officers had in Northern Ireland. So that gives you an idea of the power that the police had. Most judges and magistrates, most senior civil servants were all Protestant. Anybody taking up an important job in the civil service had to swear an oath of loyalty to the British Crown. Many nationalists wouldn't want to do that, so they were excluded. And so we had this picture of Northern Ireland. We had this society which Catholics could not get ahead in. But at the same time, from 1948, the British government had provided free education and free grammar school education to Catholic students. And so by the 1960s, there were a generation of young Catholics, men like John Hume, who's one of the most important figures in the Troubles. He was the first person in his family to go to high school, to go to grammar school. He was the first person in his family to get anything like a university education because of the education benefits provided by Great Britain. And he was growing up highly educated, highly intelligent, and frustrated because he couldn't get ahead, because there were no openings for him in the civil service. He couldn't get ahead that way. He needn't think about going into the law because most of the top jobs in the law were held by Protestants. He became a teacher and eventually a politician. But Catholics felt frustrated and held back, so that was one problem. Another problem was this was the era of civil rights, the era of Martin Luther King Jr. And all around the world you had peaceful protests, people peacefully protesting against discrimination and winning on television, because this was also the era of television. After the 5th of October 1968, a Unionist MP stood up in the Parliament in London and said to the Prime Minister, would he agree that the RUC were the finest police service in the entire world? And the Prime Minister replied, a couple of months ago I would have agreed with the right honourable gentleman, but since then we've had the BBC. And the difficulty was that when you have an MP elected to the British Parliament and you have a picture of him on TV with blood pouring down his face because an RUC officer has cracked him round the head with a baton, then it's a bit difficult to say that's an effective and fair police force. The Unionists struggled to catch the power of images. They didn't really grasp that they were in a new era and that these images went out around the world. So there was trouble. Unionists weren't really getting to grips with that trouble. Terence O'Neill, to some extent, believed that Northern Ireland and knew that Northern Ireland needed to modernise, and he did some great things. In your exam, you can be asked about what did Terence O'Neill do? Was it successful? What did he contribute to Northern Ireland? In terms of his contributions, I mean, he was able to get £900 million of investment to update industry and to try to encourage people to invest in Northern Ireland. And different companies like DeLorean, the car company which made the car you see in Back to the Future, they came to Northern Ireland. There were textiles and chemical companies, they came to Northern Ireland. In all, he created somewhere in the region of 35,000 jobs. Now, the downside to that is that about 20,000 jobs were lost in shipyards and in linen factories and places like that, but still, that's plus 15,000. So, unemployment never really fell below 7% under O'Neill's rule or O'Neill's administration, but he certainly did contribute 15,000 jobs, and he stopped the situation getting much worse. We could have had a much worse situation if O'Neill wasn't in charge. He introduced the Matthew Plan, which modernised roads. When I was young, one of the big reasons people said we should stay in the United Kingdom was because the roads were much better up here. And believe it or not, now, I mean, if you look at the roads in the south of Ireland now, they're better than what they seem to be superior in many ways to what we have in Northern Ireland. But for most of the 20th century, that wasn't the case. And a lot of this was down to O'Neill's Matthew Plan. They modernised roads, they built motorways, they created an airport. And that was very important for Northern Ireland because we needed to trade with the south of Ireland, but also with England and Scotland. And so O'Neill understood the importance of transport. Created a new city, Craigavon. Not such a great success. When I was at school and in geography, you did coursework about why Craigavon was a failure. So why it didn't turn into the city that people wanted. But there was an attempt to create a new city, created a new university at Coleraine. So those were the sort of things that O'Neill contributed to Northern Ireland. He modernised Northern Ireland. He also reached out to Roman Catholics in ways that Unionists simply weren't comfortable with, but he was prepared to go ahead and try. He visited Catholic schools. He was photographed shaking hands with Cardinal Conway of Armagh, who would have been the leader of Catholics in Northern Ireland. He offered condolences when the Pope died. That's something that a Unionist politician normally would not do. In particular, something that really bothered many Unionists is he had Sean Lemass, who was the Irish Taoiseach, and then Jack Lynch up to visit him in Stormont. He didn't even consult his own cabinet beforehand. And he brought these guys up to Northern Ireland from the south of Ireland to try and normalise relationships between the two. He also wanted to buy electricity of power stations, and he wanted to show that he was keen to reach out to Northern Ireland's Catholics. He wanted to show that Catholics had as much a place in Northern Ireland as anybody else. He still didn't get it though. He was part of the aristocracy. He was part of the landed gentry, the sort of person who used to live in a place like Downton Abbey. He didn't understand how normal people thought. He honestly believed that Roman Catholics could feel part of the Union simply if they had better jobs. Give them a nice car in the driveway and a nice house, and they'll start behaving like Protestants, seemed to be the idea, and we'd vote for the Unionist Party. He didn't understand that people have loyalties that go deeper than that, that a person's identity, their nationality, is something that they'll make a sacrifice for. And that it won't go away simply because you have a nicer car in the driveway, or because you've got a nicer kitchen, or because there's now 3 bedrooms in your house and not 2. Those are things that you can't buy, and simply saying nice things to a Catholic cardinal wasn't going to win Roman Catholics or nationalists over. He never really seemed to grasp that idea. He simply thought, well, these people just need a bit of modernisation. And it was a slightly condescending and, in its own way, quite prejudiced. It didn't really understand the Catholic mindset. He didn't seem to understand why anybody would not really want to be part of the United Kingdom. Why somebody might find their identity in another nationality. The economic progress that he made was also something which chiefly benefited Protestants, and he really didn't help himself here. If we consider the University of Coleraine made a very good bid for university. The town made an excellent bid, much better than Derry. There's a St Mary's College in Derry, and the people who ran St Mary's College got up everyone's nose. They made a terrible bid, at least compared to Coleraine. So O'Neill and those in charge made sure that the new university went to Coleraine, which was a Protestant area. The problem was that Derry was Northern Ireland's second largest city, and even the Protestants who lived in Londonderry were furious that the university did not go to Londonderry. So that's something that he could have intervened on, where he could have prevented a lot of anger, and he didn't. But also, most of the jobs that he created came east of the River Bann. They came to places like Belfast, and where there were lots of urban people who were trained to work in factories, a trained urban workforce. So it mainly benefited Protestants. Catholics tended to live west of the Bann, and places like Fermanagh and Tyrone, which were merely rural. Nobody in their right mind wanted to open a large factory at that stage. The roads weren't particularly good out there, even despite the Matthew Plan. If you're going to have a factory, you're going to want it near Belfast so you can get your goods onto the lorry and over and across the British mainland as quickly as possible, or down the motorways, get down to the south as quickly as possible. You're not going to build it out in the sticks in Fermanagh or Tyrone. But that's where the majority of Roman Catholics lived, and so they didn't benefit from the economic advances. So you see 15,000 jobs created, and you see Northern Ireland modernised, and you have this new education system which you're benefiting from. But all the while, the opportunities aren't for you, they're for Protestants, and it begins to create unease, it begins to create anger. And also, O'Neill did not appreciate his own position within unionism. He was not a popular man within the unionist community. The vast majority of Ulster unionist MPs actually wanted a different person to lead the party. And this man, Brian Faulkner's name is going to come up time and time again. They wanted Faulkner, who was very, very capable, a very, very smart politician, very shrewd and very ruthless. The vast majority of Ulster Unionists wanted Faulkner to lead the party, and Faulkner was able to lead a whispering campaign against O'Neill the whole time. You know, he's being nice to Roman Catholics. He's going to bring the whole country down around our ears. A man who was not inclined to whisper was the Reverend Ian Paisley. And Paisley's quite a character. He certainly didn't whisper. He has generally preyed on unionist fears. He generally used unionist anxieties throughout the Troubles to stay popular, and did that very effectively right up until the end of his career. In 1966, there were riots in Divis Street where Ian Paisley, threatened to march in and take a trickler down. He was a man who was prepared to create a certain amount of trouble on the streets in the 60s. He was prepared to organise counter-demonstrations to Catholic marches, which could have led to trouble. There were certainly clashes with or disagreements with the police between Paisley and the people who followed him. Particularly just before the Battle of the Bogside, actually in 1969, there was a prayer meeting that which Ian Paisley had helped organise, and after the prayer meeting there was a bit of trouble outside with a Catholic mob, and the people who were in the prayer meeting broke the chairs and came out to start fighting with the chair legs, and the police had to break the two sides up. I mean, this is the sort of crowd who would have flocked to Paisley in the 1960s. But Paisley was against any compromise, not only with the south of Ireland, but also with Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism was very different at the time. I mean, many Roman Catholic states, Italy and Spain, the Roman Catholic Church was saying there, listen, Protestants and people who aren't Roman Catholic shouldn't be allowed to evangelise. And the Irish government had something called Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, which said, Articles 2 and 3, which don't exist anymore, but basically they said, by rights, the south of Ireland should govern the north. They effectively said, listen, we own you. Now, they couldn't do a darn thing about what happened in the north of Ireland. But the bottom line was, there was this claim to the North's territory, and until something called Vatican II happened, there was an intolerance in many Roman Catholic societies of any other group. So some Roman Catholic countries wouldn't let you preach on the streets if you weren't Roman Catholic, or wouldn't let you try and recruit somebody into your religion, or made it difficult for you, would have banned certain books. So there was a sort of a fear of Roman Catholicism in the 1960s, which doesn't make sense to us today, but at the time was maybe a wee bit more reasonable than we would maybe like to acknowledge. That said, John F. Kennedy was the Roman Catholic president of the United States in the early 60s and was one of the most popular presidents, certainly in the history of the 20th century. And he never persecuted anybody. And he had shown to the world that Roman Catholicism was no threat to democracy, was no threat to anybody's rights. So there was maybe you can understand a wee bit why that hostility was there, but it's not terribly clear that how rational it was, and it certainly should never have led to rioting or persecution or prejudice or anything like that. But that helps explain why Ian Paisley's message, do not compromise one jot with Roman Catholics, do not compromise one jot with the south of Ireland. That explains why that was so popular at the time. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was really inspired by Martin Luther King and the civil rights, the battle for civil rights, which he organised. in America in the 1960s. And the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association really marched for British rights for British citizens. NICRA was peaceful. It certainly had no intention at all of causing riots. It had no intention of leading any sort of revolution. If your slogan is British rights for British citizens, you're not trying to overthrow the state. It wasn't created until February of 1967. There were other civil rights groups before that in the 60s. NICRA was the big one. And they were able to organise some marches which went off without so much as a hitch. They sang the Black Civil Rights Anthem, We Shall Overcome. What they wanted were simple things like one man, one vote. So they wanted a situation where you didn't have to own a property to be able to vote in a council election. And they wanted a situation where you didn't get more votes if you owned a business. So you could, got one vote for your house and one vote for the business that you owned. And if you owned 3 or 4 shops, you got 5 votes. They wanted an end to that. One man, one vote. They wanted an end to gerrymandering. In other words, they wanted fair division of boroughs so that Catholics got equal representation. They would have been keen to have more room for nationalists at Stormont, although there was no clear idea about how they were going to make that happen. They wanted an end to the Special Powers Act because basically they felt it was a bit unreasonable to allow policemen to flog you for no good reason, or to be thrown in jail without a trial because the Home Minister thought, well, we don't like the look of that guy. They basically wanted normal democratic rights. They wanted fair housing. That was the big issue. The bottom line was, look, we need houses, we need places to live. And in places like Derry, there were terrible problems with housing. Dungannon, terrible problems with housing. And so they wanted to make sure that a Catholic family would be able to get into a home. That was really why they wanted control of councils. That's why they wanted one man, one vote. That's why they wanted business owners to lose their votes so that more Catholics could get onto councils and get vote, allow homes to go to more Catholic families, to allow more representation. And this was the core of their case. They wanted normal democracy. So that's what the core of NICRA wanted. Now, there were people like the Derry Radicals involved. They were more communist. They were more radical. They wanted a revolution. There were members of the IRA involved. Now, they didn't control it, and the RUC at the time made it very clear to the Northern Irish government, listen, the IRA does not control NICRA. They're in there. There are members involved, but the IRA was actually a very small organisation at the time, and it was much more interested in defending the working class than Catholics in particular. They wanted a more fair Marxist socialist Ireland. They weren't particularly interested in sectarian politics. That's not to say that these were, the nicest guys in the world or anything like that, but, they weren't the threat to Northern Ireland that the IRA would become. They were involved. They were in there. Some of their members were involved in NICRA and had a bit of influence, but they didn't control it. And the RUC, who had very good intelligence in NICRA, said, look, these people aren't a threat. There were actually some unionist members. A lot of young unionists and unionist students actually marched for civil rights with NICRA at the very beginning because they felt that this wasn't fair, that Northern Ireland wasn't a fair place. If you were Catholic, you faced all sorts of obstacles that Protestants didn't face, and so there were Protestant unionist members of NICRA. That certainly did not stop Ian Paisley and O'Neill's enemies presenting NICRA as a massive IRA plot to overthrow Northern Ireland. And so Ian Paisley would quite often plan counter demonstrations. Working class Protestants didn't have it terribly easy in Ireland, in Northern Ireland either. And so there was a bit of resentment. It's almost like, why is it that Catholics get to march and complain about how hard they've got it when, we don't have it easy either? I mean, a working class Protestant who rented his house didn't get the vote. He didn't get the vote either. So there was a bit of resentment there that Paisley was able to tap into. And eventually, this would lead to the march into Derry on the 5th of October 1968. NICRA, after a couple of fairly successful, peaceful marches, organised this march into Derry on the 5th of October 1968. And unfortunately, what happened, like we heard at the start of this little lecture, the RUC baton charged the crowd and rioting spread. Very soon after, O'Neill would appear on television and say that Northern Ireland was at the crossroads, that Northern Ireland had to make a choice between democracy. He said, what kind of Ulster do you want? A happy and respected province in good standing with the United Kingdom, or a place continually torn about by riots and demonstrations and regarded as a political outcast? In other words, December 1968, O'Neill has to go on television and say, listen, if unionism does not get its act together, the United Kingdom, Westminster, the place that we want to belong to, is going to reject us. And he makes that appeal to unionists. And he also makes an appeal to NICRA. And he says to NICRA, listen, will you please stop organising marches? We need to catch our breath. Previous to this, he had gone on and offered a 5-point programme, saying that he would give Roman Catholics an ombudsman, an official person to complain to. He would remove additional votes for businesses. He would do something about the unfair housing in Londonderry. He was going to get rid of the group that run Londonderry and put in an important development commission. He would have a fair points system for houses. He had offered all of this to NICRA, and NICRA was not happy because two principles there, two important principles he did not mention. First of all, he did not say one man, one vote. He did not say one man, one vote. And that was key. And the second thing was he wasn't getting rid of the Special Powers Act. And NICRA's position was, listen, we do not live in a normal democracy until we have those things. Until you give us one man, one vote, and until you get rid of the Special Powers Act, there's not a normal democracy in Northern Ireland. But after his appeal in December, NICRA agreed to stop the marches, to give Northern Ireland a chance to breathe and to take its time and to work out the best way forward. There was no normal democracy yet. O'Neill's enemies were gathering against him. O'Neill had said that there would be something called a Cameron Commission, which would be an investigation into why these riots broke out. When this happened, some top unionists resigned and complained and said, look, this man's betraying Ulster. So O'Neill's enemies were gathering against him within unionism. The nationalists were not happy. NICRA was not happy because it had not been offered one man, one vote. It had not been told we're getting rid of the Special Powers Act, so the police can still arrest a person on suspicion without evidence and detain that person, can put that person in prison without a trial. So NICRA does not have the democracy it wants. Unionists believe that they're being betrayed. O'Neill is in a very difficult position. But in December 1968, by going on television and saying, guys, look, we're at the crossroads here. We're all at the crossroads. You can have civil war. You can have bloodshed on the streets. You can have nationalists at the mercy of unionist crowds, which is what's going to happen in 69. You can have unionists despised by the British Parliament, and unionists were viewed fairly highly up until this point by the British Parliament because unionists supported Great Britain in the Second World War. And O'Neill says, listen, unionists, you're going to lose that. You're going to lose that respect that you have if we don't stop. And so in December 68, that worked. O'Neill in December 68 got everybody to take a breath. Unfortunately, not everyone was listening.